For decades, the Cobra 427 has been remembered as an unbeatable engine, a mechanical apex that stood above its era and never found a true rival. The story is usually told in simple terms: massive displacement, overwhelming power, and total dominance. But viewed through the lens of engineering reality, the Cobra's reputation becomes harder to explain. On paper, the combination should never have worked. The engine was too large, too violent in its torque delivery, and fundamentally mismatched to the platform it was placed in. What became legendary was, at its core, a calculated risk that bordered on mechanical recklessness. The Cobra was not originally designed to carry Ford's most extreme big block. When Carroll Shelby pushed the 427 cubic inch FE into the lightweight roadster, the decision defied conventional thinking of the mid-1960s. Chassis rigidity, suspension geometry, and braking technology lagged far behind the engine's capability. Most manufacturers of the period avoided such combinations precisely because they created instability, not performance. Excess power without structural harmony usually ended in failure, not dominance. Yet Shelby ignored that logic. He treated the Cobra not as a balanced production car, but as a mechanical experiment driven by force of will. The result was an engine that rewrote expectations, not because it was refined or efficient, but because it overwhelmed every system around it. This contradiction between what should have failed and what ultimately succeeded is the foundation of the Cobra 427 myth. Understanding why this engine became untouchable requires separating legend from engineering reality. The truth is more uncomfortable and far more interesting than the simplified version that history usually repeats. The real challenge Shelby faced was not building power, it was finding a way to survive it. The Cobra's original chassis had been conceived around far smaller engines, designed for agility rather than brute force. When the 427 arrived, it exposed every structural compromise at once. Torque loads twisted the frame under acceleration. Suspension components reached their limits far earlier than intended, and braking systems struggled to cope with the speeds the car could now reach. What had once been a lightweight sports car was suddenly being asked to behave like a full-blooded race machine without the supporting architecture to match. This imbalance made the Cobra dangerous in ways that were not immediately obvious. Under hard throttle, the car could break traction unpredictably. High-speed stability suffered as the chassis flexed, subtly altering suspension geometry in motion. Even experienced drivers described the sensation as fighting the car rather than commanding it. In this configuration, the 427 was less a performance upgrade than an engineering liability, an engine capable of overwhelming every system connected to it. Most manufacturers would have stopped there. The rational decision would have been to scale the engine back or abandon the project entirely. Instead, Carroll Shelby chose escalation. Rather than adapting the engine to the car, he rebuilt the car around the engine. Frame rails were thickened, suspension pickup points redesigned, and braking systems enlarged. Each fix addressed a symptom rather than the underlying contradiction, but together they pushed the Cobra back from the edge of undrivability. The stakes at this stage were unusually high. Shelby was no longer refining a concept. He was committing to a path where failure would be public and irreversible. The Cobra 427 had crossed a line where success was no longer guaranteed by power alone, and where control became the defining challenge. To understand why the Cobra 427 behaved the way it did, the engine itself has to be separated from the mythology built around it. The 427 FE was not an enlarged street motor pushed beyond its comfort zone. It was conceived from the outset as a competition engine, engineered for sustained high load rather than daily usability. Its architecture reflected priorities that differed sharply from most production big blocks of the era. The FE platform had already proven itself in endurance racing, and the 427 variant represented its most extreme expression. Thick cylinder walls, reinforced main webs, and cross-bolted mains were chosen not for smoothness, but for survival under sustained stress. The engine's bore and stroke configuration favored airflow and high RPM breathing, while its valve train geometry supported aggressive cam profiles that prioritized output over manners. This was an engine designed to live at the edge of mechanical tolerance, not one intended to idle politely in traffic. Unlike many street-oriented big blocks, refinement was not part of the design brief. Vibration control, thermal comfort, and fuel efficiency were secondary considerations. What mattered was that the engine could accept abuse without structural failure. In that sense, the 427FE was closer in spirit to a pure racing unit than anything sold through normal dealership channels. When Ford Motor Company adapted it for limited road use, few concessions were made to civility. This deliberate over-engineering explains why the engine felt overwhelming when installed in the Cobra. Its power delivery was abrupt, its torque curve unforgiving, and its mechanical character unapologetically hostile to compromise. The dominance that followed was not accidental. The 427 was built to either assert control completely or expose the weaknesses of whatever surrounded it. Once installed in the Cobra, only two outcomes were possible: structural failure or mechanical supremacy. When the final revisions came together, the Cobra crossed a threshold that transformed it from liability into weapon. Reinforced frame rails reduced torsional flex, revised suspension geometry stabilized high-speed behavior, and wider tires finally allowed the chassis to translate torque into forward motion instead of chaos. These changes did not tame the engine, they simply gave it something solid to work against. For the first time, the 427's output could be exploited rather than merely survived. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Acceleration figures moved beyond theoretical bragging rights and into repeatable reality. At speed, the Cobra no longer felt as though it was coming apart beneath the driver. It remained demanding, but it became predictable. And predictability is what separates raw power from usable dominance. In competition settings, this shift mattered more than any published horsepower number. Rivals found themselves facing a machine that could enter corners harder, exit faster, and maintain pace over a full race distance without structural protest. What unsettled competitors most was that the Cobra achieved this without adopting the conventions of larger manufacturers. There was no electronic mitigation, no weight added in the name of comfort, and no attempt to civilize the experience. The car remained brutally honest, and in that honesty lay its advantage. For a brief period, regulatory pressure had not yet closed the window, and engineering freedom still existed in a form that allowed extremes. This was the moment when the Cobra's reputation stopped being speculative. Wins and documented performance validated what earlier versions had only promised. The gamble taken by Carroll Shelby paid off, not because the car became easy, but because it became coherent. Power, structure, and intent finally aligned. The dominance was real, but it was also fragile. It depended on conditions that would not last, and on a tolerance for risk that few were willing to accept. That fleeting alignment is why the Cobra 427 became untouchable, and why it could not remain that way for long periods. What made the Cobra 427 so effective also made it impossible to reproduce at scale. Large manufacturers studied the formula and quietly walked away. The costs were too high, not only in materials but in risk. Reinforced frames, bespoke suspension solutions, and engines built to racing tolerances did not align with mass production economics. Profit margins disappeared quickly when reliability, warranty exposure, and legal liability were calculated honestly. Regulatory pressure amplified the problem. Emissions standards tightened, safety oversight increased, and insurance companies began classifying extreme performance cars as unacceptable risks. Vehicles like the Cobra existed in a narrowing gap between what was technically possible and what was legally tolerable. For a small operation operating outside traditional corporate structures, that gap could be exploited. For major manufacturers, it represented unacceptable exposure. Internal corporate culture played an equally important role. Decision-making inside large companies favored repeatability, predictability, and brand protection. The Cobra 427 required tolerance for failure, public embarrassment, and mechanical danger. That mindset did not scale. Even when similar engines existed elsewhere, they were softened, detuned, or constrained by conservative chassis decisions. This is why the Cobra must be understood as an anomaly rather than a blueprint. Its success depended on a brief alignment of regulatory freedom, market appetite, and individual willingness to accept risk. Once any one of those factors shifted, the formula collapsed. The industry did not move forward from the Cobra's example, it moved away from it. And in doing so, an entire category of uncompromised mechanical expression quietly closed. The Cobra 427's reputation often collapses into a single explanation: horsepower. But that simplification misses the reality experienced by those who actually drove it. Power alone did not make the Cobra unbeatable. In many situations, it made it frightening. Weight distribution remained imperfect, with a heavy engine sitting far forward in a short wheelbase chassis. At the limit, the margin for correction was narrow, and mistakes were punished instantly. Driver skill became a filtering mechanism. In capable hands, the Cobra was devastatingly effective. In average hands, it was unstable, unpredictable, and occasionally dangerous. Throttle inputs that would have been manageable in other performance cars produced violent responses here. The engine did not compensate for hesitation or imprecision. It exposed them. This is why the Cobra's dominance was selective rather than universal. Acknowledging these flaws does not diminish the engine's legacy. It clarifies it. The Cobra 427 was not unbeatable because it removed difficulty, but because it rewarded mastery more completely than its contemporaries. It demanded respect rather than offering forgiveness. Many competitors built faster cars on paper. Few built cars that concentrated consequence so honestly. This distinction matters. The Cobra was not a triumph of convenience or accessibility. It was a triumph of commitment. Understanding that difference reframes the engine's story from simple supremacy to something more exacting. It was unbeatable only when approached on its own terms, and unforgiving when it was not. Today, the Cobra 427 feels less like a product of outdated technology and more like evidence of a vanished mindset. Modern engineering can easily exceed its raw performance figures, but it cannot replicate the conditions that allowed such an engine to exist in the first place. Safety standards, emissions regulations, and corporate liability frameworks now define the boundaries of what can be built long before engineers begin designing. Equally important is the cultural shift within the industry. The tolerance for mechanical risk that once defined performance development has been replaced by simulation, safeguards, and layers of mitigation. These advances have made cars faster and safer, but they have also removed the space where something like the Cobra could survive. An engine that overwhelms its platform, demands total attention, and offers no margin for error would not pass modern scrutiny. The Cobra 427 endures because it represents a moment when excess was not yet a liability. Its reputation was earned not through perfection, but through improbability. It succeeded because it existed briefly outside the systems that would later prevent it. That is why it remains unbeatable in a way numbers alone cannot explain. Its legacy is not about what it achieved, but about what can no longer be attempted. And that finality is what keeps the Cobra 427 fixed in history, not as a relic, but as an unrepeatable conclusion to a particular idea of performance.